Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Justin Shewell, and I'm also the moderator for this session. So I will just go ahead and introduce myself and get started. So a little bit about myself. I'm actually based in Arizona in the United States, and I work for Arizona State University as an educational technologist. And I really wish that I could have traveled to Dubai this year to participate in person, but that just wasn't feasible with everything else going on. So I'm glad I at least get to participate by giving this Zoom presentation. So I'm going to talk about navigating gamification 2.0 in the classroom. So I'll go ahead and get started. And I want to start by asking you what I call a $1 million question. And I want to ask, what is the biggest obstacle in student learning? Now, I don't know if anybody in the room in Dubai can answer that question or wants to, if you guys are in Zoom, you guys want to try in the chat. We have a couple of participants there.
Students' engagement, I think.
Okay.
And motivation.
I heard somebody else.
Yes, that's me, Justin. You asked what was the biggest obstacle?
Yes, to student learning.
I would think student boredom.
And I can tell you both have been teachers for a while, because that's the same thing I thought of. Yeah, in my opinion, it's motivation. Motivation is one of the biggest obstacles to student learning. And I'm sure we've all had students who weren't motivated, and we know how poorly they were able to learn. Horace Mann, he's called the father of public education because he essentially adapted the British education system for use in the United States for public education. And he said that a teacher who is attempting to teach without inspiring the pupil with a desire to learn is hammering on cold iron. And he lived back during the Iron Age, not the Iron Age, the Industrial Revolution, when things were blacksmiths and all that. So it was a very relevant quote back in the day. And it leads me to ask you a follow-up question. Why is motivation so important in learning?
I think because if they're not motivated, they will not be willing to put the time or the effort, or they will not be dedicated to the task of learning, or interested in knowing more or improving. So it's central to learning. Actually, motivation is central to every activity in life.
Yes. Yeah, I highly agree. I found a quote that I really liked. It was from Chris and Teresa Holman. Chris Holman is the director, I think, of the Motivate Lab at the University of Virginia, and he studies motivation. And Teresa Holman is a research associate there. And they wrote an article that had this quote in it. And it said, students who are motivated to learn persist longer, produce higher quality effort, learn more deeply, and perform better in classes and on standardized tests. So I thought that was it shows the importance that motivation plays in learning, both in the classroom and performing in other places as well. Which leads me to a third question. How do we improve students' motivation for learning?
I think maybe by discussing the value of learning, and the outcome that will come to them after they do a good job in learning and improving. This is important to make them aware of, the value of what they're doing or should be doing. And maybe variety in the classroom will improve. And maybe a rapport and, a lot of factors actually will help raise their motivation, I think.
So for anybody watching on Zoom and watching the recording, Amani is my plant. Do you guys know what a plant is? She's the person that I asked to sit in the audience and answer all these questions and give me great feedback to make me look like I'm doing a good job.
Yeah.
Thank you, Amani. I'm joking. I
Anytime.
never met Amani before today, but she's doing a very good job at following what I would love for her to do.
Thank you.
So yeah, so there are lots of different answers to that question. This is one that that I thought of, and of course, this is going to tie into gamification later. So I am going to talk about gamification, but really the purpose of gamification is to motivate students. So if you've never heard of the ARCS model of instructional design, it was created by a man named John Keller, who was an educational psychologist. And the model that he created focuses on the factors of motivation, which are attention, relevance, confidence, and satisfaction, ARCS, ARCS. So you can see here, we've got sort of this 4-tiered diagram with learner motivation in the center, and then the different components that lead to that motivation around the outside. And then if you look on the very outside, you'll see that there are strategies that can be used for each of those aspects of motivation in the classroom. So I'll talk a little bit more about these. This model basically assumes that people are motivated to engage in an activity if it is perceived to be linked to the satisfaction of personal needs, which is called the value aspect, and if there is a positive expectancy for success, which is called the expectancy aspect. So basically, students have to see the value in it, which is what Amani said, and they have to believe that there's a chance that they'll succeed in doing it, or they won't be motivated. So, for example, before we can teach anything, we must get students' attention. And there are lots of different ways to gain attention. According to this model, we might, for example, give them a question that they have to answer, which is inquiry. We might give them a situation that's incongruous or that creates conflict that needs to be resolved. We might also use various media or different ways to introduce the topic, which is the variability aspect. We might tell a joke for humor, or we might just get them to stand up and do something, which is the participation. So we need to get their attention. And then after we get their attention, in order to help students see the relevance of what they're learning and connect to the satisfaction of personal needs, we might provide examples of what they're learning, of how what they are learning will be useful to them now and in the future. Sometimes, though, we need to be careful because the examples that we might provide, they might not see as relevant. So I actually like the students to come up with the examples themselves, because that, I think that increases their ownership in the learning process and helps them see the relevance. Sometimes they don't see the relevance at the beginning, and it takes a little bit for them to understand how what they're learning will be useful. If we can aid in their confidence by providing clear instructions and making sure they know what the expectations are. I give my students, before any assignment, I give them the grading rubric and say, here's how I'm going to be grading your assignment. Here's exactly what you have to do to get 100% on this assignment. And sometimes students will follow exactly what's on the rubric, and sometimes they won't, but at least they know what what my expectations are. I also will provide them with positive feedback and acknowledge students' efforts in a way that makes them feel successful. So that's the satisfaction part of ARCS. A lot of the satisfaction can come from natural consequences. Students do well, they know what their expectations are, they're going to have satisfaction because they've, even though that's just the natural consequence of doing well, right? So that's the ARCS model of design. So what does that have to do with gamification? This is a rhetorical question, so you don't have to worry about answering it. But think about it. What is it about digital games that gets people to play them for hours and hours on end without losing engagement? Okay, think about your favorite games. I know you guys have one. What is it about the game that motivates you? So we've got two people here in the Zoom room. Do you guys have a favorite game?
Okay, I'll go because my answer is going to be very short. I don't do games. Sorry.
Not at all?
No, I'm not one. Well, you mean in the classroom? Yes, I do Kahoot and quizzes and educational things. But for myself, in my personal capacity, I find it, I come from a Generation X. We don't, I'm not really a games person.
You don't play a digital game on your phone or anything like that?
I'm afraid not. I'm very boring. I'm sorry.
That's okay. How about you, Amani?
I don't do either games. I don't have the time, actually. I'm too busy. However, I think what makes people so, hooked is, maybe immediate feedback, maybe the challenge, maybe the competition. I don't know.
Yeah, well, all of those. See, Amani's doing exactly what I hoped she would. So if you think about those elements that you mentioned, the challenges, the immediate feedback, et cetera, and you take those elements and you apply them into a non-game context, so into a classroom or a learning activity, that's the definition of gamification. It's not so much playing games in the classroom, but it's taking those aspects of games that are motivating to the users, who in our case are learners, and applying those same principles into something that's not a video game or a digital game. So this is a list of some aspects of games that have been shown to improve student motivation. We've got things like the progress mechanics, points, levels, statistics, leaderboards, etc. Okay, we've got narratives and characters, player control, social connection, and environment, meaning the environment of the game itself. They're in a second world, and sort of it goes along with the story and the characters, but there's also things like they might have to, you get coins to buy things, etc. So that's sort of what we're talking about with the environment. So if you look at these things, you'll see that there's many of the ARCS components that are found in these game elements. We have the use of narratives and stories, especially stories that involve problems to be solved that keep students' attention. And that's often what will get students playing for hours and hours on end, not just the fact that they're earning points or they're going up a level or whatever, but that they're part of the story, right? We also give the students control within gamification, and that helps make the learning relevant. They're making choices, and now because of their choices, something changes, and so it becomes more relevant. There are also opportunities for modeling, which was part of the relevance part of ARCS as well. We have, I mentioned already, the progress mechanics, which are a great way for providing feedback to students, which helps build their confidence. The more successes they have, then the more confident they're going to feel. They also have a lot, in gamification, typically learners have a lot of control over their learning, which helps also increase their confidence. You have, in the satisfaction area, you have the social connection and the praise that they receive from other students. And there's many other connections as well. So this wheel here that's on the right side of the screen, it's called the gamification taxonomy, and it takes 21 different game elements and divides them out into 5 categories. And the purpose of this taxonomy is to help teachers to decide what game elements they might include in their classrooms. So I want to give some basic principles of what I call gamification 2.0. And I'm calling it gamification 2.0, referring to the version versus gamification 1.0, which would have been the first version. Because in my mind, gamification has changed due to the way learners interact with games and feel about games in today's world. So today's learners are much more familiar with video games than learners were even a decade ago. When the term gamification was first used, probably more than a decade ago now. And because of that, while the ideas behind gamification haven't really changed, all the way that we apply gamification into the classroom has changed. So that's why I'm calling it 2.0. So the first principle is that just including a single game component doesn't really qualify as gamification. If you want to improve students' motivation, you need to include elements that hit all the aspects of ARCS, or most of them. So if you just keep their attention, by using a story, that's not going to work if they don't receive any feedback and don't feel successful. If you just included a progress component, which showed them, which might help to increase their confidence, but they had trouble moving up your levels, they would get discouraged and actually become demotivated. So you've got to include more than just one component in there to help to actually have it be considered gamification and to improve students' motivation to learn. Now, these aren't in any order, any particular order. It's not like they're a sequence. But the second principle is you need to pick a number. Choose one thing to focus on that students will work to increase, okay? Gamification is often talked about in business circles. And so you have numbers like the amount of time they spend on a website or various things like that. So that could be, those are examples of numbers that you might pick, the amount of time they spend practicing, or the amount of time they spend engaged in a certain activity, etc. It could be their grade, but using the grade as the number that they're trying to improve could be detrimental because it goes up so slowly that they'll lose confidence in their ability. They won't see their successes. So you got to find something that they value and that they want to work to increase and use that. The third principle is to remember that your learners are smart. They're not going to work to increase a number that they don't care about, or they're not going to work to increase a number that has no value to them. So if you think about the numbers in video games, there's always something tied to those numbers. There's the prestige of having the highest score or the reward you get when you get past a certain level. So your learners are going to want to see the value of increasing whatever the number is that you choose. The fourth principle is that your learners are going to see the results. They need to see how the gamification impacts them and their learning. After a while, even after just a couple of weeks sometimes, the novelty of the game will wear off. And if there's no value in the gamification, if you just included elements of gamification, but the students don't see the value of it, they'll stop playing. They'll become demotivating. And I don't mean like playing games in the classroom, but they won't see it as motivating anymore, and it'll become demotivating. So, but if they see that they've improved or they have gotten value from their learning, then they'll continue to be motivated to play the game, so to speak. A fifth principle is to use extrinsic rewards. Now, as teachers, I'm sure we'd love to have all of our students intrinsically motivated, but I've never had that be the case. So you'll always have those students who are required to sit in your class, but they really don't want to be there. And by focusing on extrinsic rewards, you have a better chance of motivating even those students to learn. The rewards can be anything that the students value. I've seen examples of things like extra points, a pass that lets them skip an assignment or get full points even though they turned an assignment in late. Those types of rewards don't cost any money, and they're usually at the discretion of the teacher in most cases. We'll talk more about rewards a little bit later, and I'll give some other examples. And sixth principle is to make sure and keep it simple. Your learners aren't going to care how long you spent thinking up this imaginary world where they have to use English in order to survive and complete quests like going to the grocery store or completing a job interview in English in order to win points. Even though that world is not really imaginary, because as soon as they enter an English-speaking environment, that's what they have to do. But if your gamification is too complex or hard to understand, they're going to lose interest. So when you gamify your lessons or your classroom, be sure to keep it simple enough that you can explain it in just a couple of sentences. Another principle is you need to know your audience. Gamification is never a one-size-fits-all technique. So I've given a couple of examples here. I'll give some other ones later on. You can't just take my examples and use them in your classroom without some type of modification. Your students are going to be motivated by different types of rewards, different types of stories, activities, etc. So you really need to apply your gamification to the learners you have, which means you might end up doing different things with different classes, even though you're teaching the same thing. And the last principle I'll talk about for this segment is forget ludemes. And ludeme is a game designer's term, and it means an element in a game that is common across all games. So things like achievements, badges, levels, and experience points. Those exist in many games, and in most games, they're the same. Learners nowadays are so familiar with those that they generally won't be motivated by them. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't use them, but you'll want to combine them with other game components. Using any one of those ludemes by themselves can actually be demotivating to your learners. So let's talk about 3 aspects of games that we know work to improve students' motivation to learn. The first one is validation. And if you think of validation, this includes things like upvotes, retweets, likes, etc. Okay, so that's one reason why Snapchat or Facebook or Twitter is so addictive for students, because it includes validation. Things like this let students know that people liked what they did, and it can be a great motivator in learning. Students will feel successful when other students give them positive feedback about their work. It does take quite a bit of training to do it successfully, however. For example, you need to provide training to your students on how to provide quality feedback that's constructive, and you need to have guidelines to prevent students from giving ineffective or destructive feedback, because that can be very demotivating. But in this case, you know how they say never read the comments on the internet? Well, in this case, you want the students to read the comments. So one of the ways that I provide validation in my classes is by using peer feedback. Students will read each other's writing and provide constructive comments based on the grading rubric about how they like the writing and how it can be improved. They are required to find at least 2 positive things to comment on for every 1 improvement that they suggest. So that's one of the guidelines I gave them to encourage positive feedback. It takes several trials before they learn how to do this effectively, which is why we'd usually do it on the first writing assignment of the semester, so that they can continue doing that in other writing assignments. If you have a digital environment in your classroom, like a website, then you can do this online. We use the comment section, the comment tool in Google Docs, but there are other ways to do it. It doesn't have to be technology-based, even though technology sometimes makes it easier. Before I used Google Docs, I used to have the students read another student's writing and then write their comments on a second piece of paper. And then they passed both the student's writing and the second piece of paper to another student who did the same thing. And we kept going around until they each read 5 other students' writing. Now we use Google Docs to do it, but the idea is basically the same thing. Another game component that works well is the idea of completion. And this simply means that they're working to complete a task or a series of tasks. And the idea of finishing the task, getting to 100% on that progress bar, is motivating to them, okay? If you guys have ever used LinkedIn, when you first sign up, it shows a progress bar above your profile. And it shows suggestions on how you can reach 100%, things like adding in your work experience, etc. I don't know about you guys, but when I first joined LinkedIn, I saw that and I was like, okay, I got to go do all those things, because it was motivating for me to see that progress bar move to 100%. It's easy to visualize where you are, and it's easy to see how you have to reach that goal. So in a similar way, providing an easy way for students to track their progress and showing them how they can reach their goals keeps them engaged and motivated. I use a digital gradebook in my classes. I have for almost 20 years. Because it lets students log in and see their progress anytime. But that's not enough. Students have to know what's expected of them and how they can reach their goals. So I'll give you another example of how I use completion. In a reading class I taught, the learning objectives for that class were focused on various types of reading tasks, such as finding the main idea, reading for details, etc. So I created a list of all the reading tasks for that class and a list of different self-paced learning activities that students could do that would help them master each specific reading task. And I called it the reading menu. When students came into the class, we had individual work time where students would work independently on the activities from the reading menu. And once they finished the task, they submitted it to me for grading. And I updated their progress in the gradebook. Then they moved on to the next reading task. This left me free to work with the students who needed more help. In addition to the completion aspect of this structure, I let them to complete the tasks on the menu in any order they chose, so it added more learner control and relevance to the learning. We weren't playing a game. I didn't call it a game, but I used game elements in to structure those learning activities, and it kept students motivated. I know I'm almost out of time, so the last one is prizes. Okay, again, no matter how much we wish our students were intrinsically motivated, it doesn't usually happen that way. And in most cases, it takes some form of extrinsic motivation to get students to complete learning activities, okay? I've already talked about one form of extrinsic motivation being grades. And we all know students who care all about the grade and only about the grade. And in some cases, they don't even see the connection between the grade and what they do in the classroom. This is an example of an ineffective use of extrinsic rewards, okay? Extrinsic rewards or prizes work well when they are used with tasks that have clear expectations and outcomes and don't involve complex skills. So small tasks or learning activities that lead to a larger goal are great for extrinsic rewards, such as the reading tasks I mentioned earlier. Small extrinsic rewards can lead to greater intrinsic motivation in the long run. And you can use extrinsic rewards for non-academic tasks like providing positive feedback to their peers or turning in an assignment on time. And you can use a variety of rewards. Make sure they are things that your students will value. So now that you've heard my opinions on how to improve students' motivation to learn by applying game elements to learning, I hope you will be able to take a look at your own classrooms and consider how you can improve your students' motivation to learn as well. And I have 3 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Justin. This was very informative. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for being such a good plant. Come on.
Justin, I have a question.
Sure.
You mentioned that to improve, that there were really 7 elements that in your 2.0 model of improving gamification. Do you know if any educational apps that can just do that ready-made? Or something like Kahoot has been working very well in an educational environment for a while, so as quizzes and other educational games. Is there anything on the market that does that all in one for teachers?
No, and I think the person who created that would corner the market and probably be more wealthy than Elon Musk, I would assume. The biggest problem with something like that is gamification has to be really personalized and tailored for your learners. And so the way that you do it in one class might not be the same way that you do it in another class. The elements that you want to use, the stories. So in my experience, whenever I've tried to use gamification, I sort of have to do it on a case-by-case basis. Like the writing class, I used the Google Docs comments because we had that available. It was easy. I've seen some tools that will have the ability to sort of like rank, vote students' work up and down, different things like that. But I've never seen a single tool that has all of those different things in it. But you often don't need technology. I mean, technology makes it easier. It's really easy when I put the grade in a student's grade book that they then see their progress and they sort of see it go up. But I could have a paper chart, that has it drawn out, and I just color in the next little box, right? For teaching younger learners, you see a lot of those types of things, at least in America. If you walk into a first grade classroom in the United States, you'll see gold stars and stickers and star charts and all these different things that are essentially that same idea of getting the students motivated by tracking progress and doing other things. So there's typically a non-technology based way to do it as well.
Thank you.
That's a great question, though. And that's one of the things I often, whenever I do teacher training workshops on gamification, I often encourage the teachers who are attending to connect with other teachers, find out what they're using, find out how they're using it, and then share that with each other, because that's how you find out about different apps and different applications of things that you might not have thought of before. So. And our time is up, so I'm going to stop the recording.